Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. We are the Botanic Garden of Texas, and what we're striving to do is have a good representation of native plants that are native to different parts of the state. So for those of you that are in places in Texas that aren't Austin, maybe you'll recognize some of these plants that are your outdoor neighbors. So Angel addressed some of the temporal and seasonal topics. You know, basket flowers is happening right now. This is its time of year, for example. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the spatial or geographic patterns of native plants and their distributions a little bit. I think it's interesting, you know, as we're all, trying to stay physically apart from each other during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's still safe to enjoy the company of our native plant friends. We can stay at home with these native plants, stay at home with our friends, the plants. And that has another meaning too, as we look at how we're using native plants in our home range. So if you're looking at plants that are native to your area, some of the things that you might see are things that we have in this garden. Let me back up just a little bit and talk about what we mean when we talk about the word native plant. It's a term that we end up using a lot, but there's a lot to it, and actually it's kind of hard to define. But I think a good shorthand is to say that it's a plant that occurs naturally where it evolved, and that's a pretty good catch for most things that you would be talking about. I also think it's really important to overlay geography on top of that as well. If you were, say, to go to a garden center and ask them, maybe you live in Fort Worth and you ask them for some native plants, they might show you something that's native to deep East Texas, maybe, I don't know, a oak leaf hydrangea or something, which may be native to the country, may be native to Texas, but not necessarily from your area, and it may not do as well for you. A lot of it goes back to what your goals are for using native plants. If you're trying to provide habitat, if you're trying to do a restoration, you might be a little bit more restrictive in your definition. If you're just trying to find plants that are well adapted, some of the plants from other parts of the state might do well in your area, or maybe not. If you're trying to support wildlife, it's probably better to stick as close as possible to your immediate area. Some people might say, I want plants that are native 50 miles, maybe 100 miles away from where I'm gardening. And that might be one way to look at it. Or you could do it on an ecoregion kind of basis. So in Austin, we are on the cusp of the Blackland Prairies to the east of us and the Texas Hill Country to the west of us. So depending on the kind of soils you're gardening in, that will influence the kind of plants that you would select. So just thinking about that, and really just thinking about why you're wanting to use native plants. So I would like to ask you all to maybe just think about what are some of your favorite plants and why are those favorites? Maybe the plant reminds you of somebody you know, or maybe a place that you've been, or a time in your life. And maybe this is something that you could post up on the chat during this meeting. I think it might be interesting to your fellow participants to see what your favorite plants are and why they're your favorite plants. There's always some good stories that come out of that. Then I'm sitting here in front of a plant garden, a garden full of friends that have been identified by the Wildflower Center staff. This is our staff favorites, or our staff picks garden. And it's similar to like if you went to a bookstore or a grocery store where the staff there have labeled, these are books that we recommend, or maybe this is a great can of soup that you should try. So here we have a collection of plants that our staff have really appreciated for various reasons. And auspiciously, we have an excellent geographic distribution of these plants, or examples from different parts of the state. So maybe you'll recognize some of these plants as some of your neighbors. So let me start with this little cute plant over here. This is a plant called cardinal feather. It's a Acalypha radians, which is in the euphorbia family. So if you're familiar with euphorbias, maybe you are familiar with the tropical Acalyphas. This is a relative of that's native to central, but really more South Texas. It's adapted to regions that are fairly dry, and you'll see it's kind of short and small. It has kind of a reddish tinge to the foliage, which is pretty cool. That's another way that the plant helps adapt itself to intense sunlight that it might be experiencing. One of the interesting things about this species too is that you'll have male and female plants. So the flowers are different on one plant from another. So this is a male plant that has the flowers with the little anthers there. The female flowers are much smaller in the foliage of the plant. So you can tell the difference between those. If you want them to seed out, you'd want to have both. But actually, I think the male ones are kind of cute. They're cheerful. Amy, who's one of our staff members, says, I love moss, and this is about the closest thing I can think of that falls into the full sun native Texas category. The flowers are like little pipe cleaners. Definitely true. And then Leslie recalls seeing it for the first time in the wild at Lake Amistad, and it had a preciousness about it. It was one little plant, but it really stood out visually. So that's a little plug for the cardinal feather. Another plant that I'd like to mention is this Mexican feathergrass, which is native to West Texas, like the Trans-Pecos. And this time of year especially, but really anytime, it just wants to be petted. It's really hard to walk past this plant and not just rub your fingers through it. It's a very tactile kind of experience. And many plants that are native to this kind of hot, dry, very harsh, sunny conditions that you would find in the Trans-Pecos tend to have narrow leaves or small leaves, which is a way that the plant is adapted to have smaller surface area that's exposed to that kind of harsh UV light. Also, the smaller surface area of the leaves can help reduce evapotranspiration, which allows the plants to conserve water. A lot of plants that you'll see from desert areas also might have kind of a silverish look to them, and that may be a result of little tiny hairs or maybe a waxy coating. Again, that's to help the plant retain moisture and also reflect some of the UV light. So feathergrass and other plants that you might find in West Texas. Giant coneflower is another one that is just spectacular this time of year. I mean, look at that glory. This is in the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. Rudbeckia maxima. Rudbeckia, you might be familiar with, is the genus of the brown-eyed Susan or black-eyed Susan. The species name maxima tells you, it refers to how large this plant is. This is a maxima plant. Again, Amy says, they're so tall. Some are taller than Lee, and Lee is one of our coworkers who's about 12 feet tall, so this is a big plant. They look prehistoric to me, and even their foliage is pretty when they're not in bloom, and that's definitely true. It has a nice broad leaf, kind of a coarse textured plant that looks great. Even in the wintertime, it has a nice rosette of this broad gray leaf foliage to it. Dick Davis, who is another one of our staff members, claims that it's so impressive with its outsized beauty. And I think that's definitely an accurate description of this plant. Being in the sunflower family, it's really a great plant for attracting various kinds of pollinators. You'll see a lot of butterflies. Sometimes I'll see hummingbirds, even though you think of hummingbirds as preferring plants that have a tubular shaped flower that might be red or orange. Hummingbirds will go to this plant also. So it has a lot of benefits to it. It's native to East Texas. You might find it in a bar ditch. The broad leaves are another way that the plant can absorb more sunlight. Makes a nice cut flower, but also just in a garden, it just have that really strong vertical form, which makes it really an impressive standout plant. Another little plant that is fun to talk about is one of these salvias. This is Mealy blue sage, or Salvia farinacea. It's in the mint family, so it's related to mints. A lot of our culinary herbs are also in the mint family, like basil, rosemary, thyme. Those are all plants that are in the mint family. And being in the mint family, being a salvia, it also has fairly aromatic foliage, which some people have used the leaves to make an infusion, like a tea that you can drink. I've tried it. It's not my favorite, but I do think it's fun to experiment with the edible properties of some of our native plants, and we have a lot of wonderful ones that really do taste good. A lot of them are perennials, like the Salvia farinacea, the Mealy blue sage. So you don't have to replant them every year. They can be ornamental in themselves, and then you just happen to be able to harvest them to use them in your kitchen. the species name, Salvia farinaceae, the plant has what's called farina. That's a botanical name. And farina means mealy, which is where the name Mealy blue sage comes from. And so it's kind of a starchy texture to parts of the plant. And that's where that name comes from. Julie, one of our gardeners here, she says, I love all the members of the Salvia genus, but this one's my favorite because of the blue coloring. And there are really very few flowers that have that deep blue color to them. This is also a wonderful plant for attracting bees in particular, bumblebees. A lot of our native bees will definitely swarm on this plant. And I've also seen hummingbirds come to it. Again, you think of them going to red flowers, but they like to come to the blue flowers of this Mealy blue sage also. It blooms heavily in spring and fall, and then kind of sporadically throughout the summer. You can trim it back to new growth that comes out to the base if you want to refresh it during the summer. But that's a really great native plant, the Mealy blue sage. Behind me here is another plant. This is rock rose Pavonia. If you can see the flowers, they're a nice clear pink. They look very much like a hibiscus. You might recognize them as being related to hibiscuses. They're in the Malvaceae, or the same family. And this plant is really great for attracting some of the smaller butterflies. I see skippers, for example, that really like to come to it. This is a plant that blooms in the summer, as do most of the Malvaceae. Most of the plants in this family really enjoy the heat. They bloom throughout the summer, and even though it really prefers heat and does well in the heat, it also can tolerate some shade, so it makes it a little bit of a versatile plant. This is about mature height. It just kind of makes a nice shrubby plant. Behind here we have a grass that's Sidotes grama, and Susan, one of our people that works in our nursery, says, hey, it's the state grass of Texas, and this is true. So honoring our state with our state grass, the Sidotes grama. Another grass that we have nearby is a bushy blue stem, and Julie refers to the flowers. She says, it reminds me of the fur of a dog I had, fluffy and about the same color. So that's a pretty entertaining notation to make. So this is a collection of plants that are favored by various staff members. When people ask me what some of my favorite plants are, you know, it makes me squirm. It really is like asking someone who their favorite child is. My opinion varies from day to day, from you know, if it's a Tuesday or Wednesday, it might influence what I really might be favoring at any particular time. Mrs. Johnson purportedly had Texas bluebells on the top of her favorites list. And I've heard her also say that she really liked anything that was doing well for her. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is what's going to do well in your particular situation. Another thing that I think ties in with this is a quote that Mrs. Johnson had. I don't have the exact quote, but it was something to the effect of she wanted Texas to look like Texas, and California to look like California, Maine to look like Maine, to really try to counter the homogenization of the American landscape. And really, if you're using locally native plants, you're going to be, just by nature, you're going to be honoring your natural heritage and supporting that flavor, that local flavor, just like you would support a local business. So planting native plants is a really great way to do that. Then she also had a quote. Here's a quote for her. I like it when the land speaks its own language in its own regional accent. So that's a nice way of looking at that. So I wanted to also suggest another mental exercise, and we'll go to East Texas. That's where Mrs. Johnson was born. So if you can imagine what it's like to walk through a piney woods, a piney forest in East Texas, what does it sound like? What does it feel like? What are the smells and the sounds that you experience? What kind of memories does it invoke? And contrast that with an experience you might have had, say, in West Texas. And if you haven't been to these places, you can think of some other locations that you've been. If you think of West Texas, what does that smell like or feel like or look like? And a lot of it, you know, in West Texas might be a lot about the geology, but in East Texas, it's really dominated by plants. And even the geology in West Texas is influencing the vegetation quite dramatically. And the plants themselves have a huge role to play in the overall feeling of that space. So think about those kinds of experiences and, just engaging all of your senses. I think it's also helpful for us to be able to counter what we call plant blindness by looking and actually seeing the plants that are around us. We can honor our local communities by supporting the natural world as part of our community. We can recognize that the plants are part of that community. And vast parts of our natural landscape really don't exist anymore. They're altered in some way, largely by invasive species, but also just loss of space. So maybe we can say that we want to belong to a place rather than make it belong to us. David Frost is a member of the California Native Plant Society. Many years ago had a quote that I really appreciate. He says, "This is how we make our gardens here. These are the plants that tell us we're home." And I just feel like that's a wonderful way of summarizing using native plants in your landscape. So I hope that we will see you here out at the Wildflower Center at some point. We are open and would love to show you around and continue this conversation. And with that, I think I'm going to send it back to Angel.